Hello, welcome to the fourth session of our course on the Scottish Wars of Independence. Today we are going to be looking at the struggle of the Guardian. Our aim today is to learn how the Guardians took control of Scotland after Alexander III's death. Hopefully by the end of this session you'll be able to describe the challenges that faced the six Guardians between the years 1286 and 1289 and be able to explain whether or not the Guardians can be considered successful in their rule of Scotland during this time. For students of higher history who are watching this video, advice as always is to take notes from the comments that you see appearing in bold on the screen. This is so you can compile a set of revision notes that cover the course working towards the final exam. Scone Parliament in 1286. This came in the months just after Alexander III's death back in March. The community of the realm there met at Scone in April and they agreed that Margaret, the Maid of Norway, would be their queen. Now, if you remember from the previous video, the Community of the Realm didn't represent everybody in the Kingdom of Scotland. The Community of the Realm represents the noblemen and the high-ranking clergy or bishops of Scotland. It does not represent the peasants. However, at the time, this is a fairly remarkable organisational body, I guess, as most kingdoms in Western Europe at that time were feudal, and they would have had a king at the top of their society who would have replaced the previous dead king. So it's very unusual that Scotland has almost seen a council of nobles come together to decide what to do. Unusually again as well, they decide that Alexander III's only living relative, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, would be their queen. At this point in 1286 she is 2, going on 3, and living in Norway. Now, the Community of the Realm also agreed to elect 6 guardians to govern Scotland until Margaret is old enough to rule herself. Now, these 6 guardians would be drawn from the Community of the Realm. It's important to note that they are not the Community of the Realm themselves. The community is this wider group of nobles and bishops across the country. The guardians are just these 6 men who are chosen to rule on their behalf. Their job was to run Scotland until the maid was considered old enough to take over the reins of the job herself. To put that into context, her grandfather Alexander III took over when he was a child as well. He succeeded his dad at the age of 8 and he was given full control of the kingdom at the age of 21. So the 6 guardians are definitely signing up for the long haul here. Their last job, perhaps one of the most important ones, is to keep peace in the kingdom of Scotland until the maid reaches adulthood. Who were these guardians then? The guardians were very carefully chosen and drawn from across the kingdom. Running through who these 6 men were, and they were men, this is a very sexist time, remember. We have Alexander Comyn, the Earl of Buchan. Now Buchan is up in the northeastern corner of Scotland, you can see it on there on the map. His cousin, John Comyn, the Lord of Badenoch, he was a baron and one of the big kind of landowners in Scotland. He is based in the kind of central Highlands, as you can see, round about, I guess, where Aviemore is today. Our third guardian was Bishop William Fraser of St Andrews. At this time St Andrews was possibly, I guess, the most important religious centre in Scotland. It was reputed to hold some of the relics or some of the bones of the actual St Andrew, who had been brought to Scotland from their resting place in Greece a few centuries before. That led to a giant cathedral being built in St Andrews, so pilgrims could come and visit it, and obviously the church is going to make some money off of that. Therefore, the bishop in charge of that cathedral became quite a wealthy and important man in Scottish politics. So that, at that time, was Bishop William Fraser. Duncan Macduff also had a seat on the Guardians' Council. Now, the Earl of Fife had an important role in Scotland's kind of nobility and monarchy, in that each new king of Scotland was crowned during the ceremony by the Earl of Fife. So this man would have an important role to play. When the Maid of Norway eventually reached adulthood, he would be the one, presuming he was still alive, who would place the crown upon her head and bring in formally Scotland's next sovereign. The 5th member was Bishop Robert Wishart of Glasgow. At that time, Glasgow Cathedral wasn't far off the building that you see today if you're to go and visit it. It would have been massive as a structure for its time and quite a remarkable building to go and see. If you consider the average peasant living in a village in Scotland, you're more likely going to be in a hovel with a couple of rooms. There might even be a mud floor if you're unlucky. It's going to be wattle and daub walls. You'll be lucky if it's got stone walls, probably a thatched roof. You're living in these circumstances in villages numbering maybe dozens to a couple hundred people at a time. If you're to make the journey to Glasgow and see this gigantic stone building with massive flagstone floors, possibly having stained glass windows in it as well, massive vaulted ceilings, it is going to be just absolutely mind-blowing and majestic, and a symbol of power, the power of God, but also the power of the bishop that controlled that building. So that at that time was Bishop Robert Wishart of Glasgow. So I recommend you visit Glasgow Cathedral. Actually, it's free to get in. Go and have a wee poke around and you'll see Bishop Robert Wishart's tomb is actually in the cathedral vault, and you can go and see where his body is laying. Our sixth guardian is James the High Steward, the Baron of Renfrew, another big and important landowner in Scotland. He's based in Renfrew, which more or less covers where the Braehead shopping centre is today. He also controls lands down into Inverclyde, or Cunningham as it was called back then, and he also owns the island of Bute, so right on our doorstep. So these 6 men, as you can see from the map, are scattered across Scotland. They represent the major landowners, the major older noble families, and the most powerful men in the church at this time in Scotland. Significantly, 2 very important people are not sitting on the Council of Guardians, and those are the men who possibly had the strongest claims to step up and take the throne of Scotland if it wasn't to be the Maid. This can be the Bruce family and the Balliol family. Now, to avoid tension in the kingdom and to avoid conflict breaking out, these 2 men have not been selected to stand as guardians for Scotland, so they cannot further their interests and try and take control of the council and put themselves in charge. They have their friends on the Guardians, yes, for instance James the High Steward was friends with the Bruce faction, and Bishop William Fraser of St Andrews was very close to the Balliol faction. The Commons were actually cousins with John Balliol as well, so you can see there's a lot of influence, a lot of friendship with these 2 major families, but they themselves are not on the council. So the decrees of the Guardians, what did they actually decide to do when they took up their roles? So these are the laws that they issued. They asked the nobility of the realm to swear fealty to Margaret, the Maid of Norway. So that meant all the nobles of Scotland had to swear an oath that the Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was the rightful ruler of Scotland and that she would inherit the throne when she was old enough. The Guardians also decreed that they would rule Scotland in the name of the throne until she was old enough to take over. So they're basically declaring that they're going to be caretakers of the Kingdom of Scotland until the Maid is old enough to make decisions for herself. They're going to be the ones in charge of gathering taxes, they're going to be the ones in charge of deciding the policy of the kingdom, how it interacts with its neighbours, how it spends its money. The Guardians will be the one making those decisions. The Guardians also took on the role of being responsible to find a suitable husband for the Maid of Norway. Now, this seems a bit early, doesn't it? Seeing as she's only 2 or 3 years old at the time when they're appointed. But as the sole surviving member of Alexander III's line, it was going to be very important that when she was old enough that she produced an heir so the family line could continue. That is necessarily going to involve selecting a husband for her. Now, in medieval times, especially in the royal household, marriages are not based on love, they are based on necessity and on the benefits that a union of marriage will bring to both parties. So these Guardians are going to have to select a male suitor who is going to be good for the Kingdom of Scotland, who's going to bring prosperity and who's going to bring security to the kingdom. So unfortunately the poor Maid of Norway is going to have almost no say in who that person is going to be. The Guardians would also have control over Scotland's finances, and they could summon its army if required. That was actually one of the key roles of any king of a land, was the ability to raise the kingdom's army to defend the kingdom as need be. The Guardians have been given the powers to do that if they feel that Scotland comes under threat. As a symbol of their authority, this seal down in the bottom right hand side, remember this time in medieval Europe, your average person cannot read or write. The only educated ones really are priests or monks who work with the church. They'll be taught Latin and they have to read obviously so they can read the Bible and the different texts of the Gospels. They would have educated some of the nobles, yes, but it's by no means common that all nobles can read. So in order to stamp something with your signature, the nobles all created their own seals or symbols which people would come to recognise. And even though you couldn't read their name written on a bit of parchment or on a notice, you would recognise the symbol of the various different powerful nobles and bishops and recognise therefore that their order, if it had that symbol on it, had to be obeyed. So the Guardians came up with their own symbol, and instead of having a picture of the king, as most royal symbols did, this one had a picture of Scotland's patron saint, St Andrew. And you see down there, he is crucified on a diagonal cross, just like St Andrew's cross, which is why St Andrew's cross is like that. He was apparently crucified on a cross that was tipped on its side. So that symbol will be created to be used on royal documents that the Guardians issue. So every time they issue a law, it will be stamped with that official symbol. And this is basically the sign of their authority. With the Guardians in charge, early threats start to emerge. This is not going to be plain sailing for the future of Scotland. Neither Robert the Bruce or John Balliol, these two main contenders who were vying for the throne of Scotland, were appointed as Guardians. Now, their rival claims to the throne made it politically explosive for them to be on the council together, as previously discussed. These men would not agree with each other, and placing them both onto a council to rule the kingdom would have just created conflict and division. Each of them, as noted as well before, do have supporters on that Council of Guardians. So they have a voice there, they have influence, but they don't have a direct say. Now the Bruce faction decide to make the first move. This comes early on in 1286 after Alexander III's death. Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, who is at this point in his 70s, so he is old for the time, still obviously vigorous in that he wants to press his claim to take the throne of Scotland, but he is an old man and he does not have time on his side, so he has to act quickly. He makes the first move. Believing that Scotland's nobles would not support the idea of a young queen being placed on the throne, Bruce gathers a small army to make a bid for power for himself. Now, the Bruce lands in Scotland are based down in the southwestern corner of the kingdom, so modern day Dumfries and Galloway is where you would find their heartland. Their old castle of Carrick, that's not Castle Carrick on Loch Goyle. Castle Carrick down on the coast of kind of Ayrshire into Dumfries and Galloway is where they had their seat. Now it's destroyed, it's just a stump sitting on the coast. Back then it was quite an impressive stronghold. That's where Bruce is based. He gathers a small force of men, and we're only talking a few hundred here, and he seizes royal castles from the surrounding towns around his lands. So he goes to the town of Wigton, to Dumfries, and to Buttle in southwest Scotland and seizes these 3 castles. Now, what is he doing with this? It's important to have a look at Bruce's background before we launch into learning about what he's up to. Bruce's family are Normans. They come from France. Now, in the opening lesson on the Scottish Wars of Independence, we talked a wee bit about Alexander's golden age and the background to him putting the kingdom together. Scotland as a land only really came together as one joined up kingdom, I guess, under Alexander III himself in 1263 when he forced the Vikings out of the Western Isles. That was one of the final steps in a long process of piecing together all these different individual kingdoms that made up northern Britain and making them into Scotland. Now that only happens 20 years before this conflict now, so the idea of Scotland is very new. The Normans, as I said, had come from France, and when they invaded England in 1066 and took over that kingdom, the King of Scotland at the time realised the way the wind was blowing and didn't want to see Scotland, as it was then, getting invaded by the Normans too, so he offered them lands in Scotland and invited them in order to avoid this invasion. He wanted basically to make allies with them. So some of the Norman families were gifted lands across Scotland, and the Bruces are descended from some of these Norman settlers. That created a bit of a divide in the Kingdom of Scotland between these new continental settlers in the kingdom and the old Gaelic families of nobles who are kind of very much associated with the clan system. By the time we get round to Alexander III's reign, the old Gaelic families of nobles have been kind of pushed to the side. They're kind of regarded as old-fashioned and unfashionable. And the Bruces and the Norman nobles like them have kind of stepped up to the fore when they're the ones that are at the centre of the royal court. So they represent a bit of a division within the kingdom by holding power themselves. But the Bruces also had lands outside of Scotland. They had land in Northern Ireland. If you look at a map of Scotland, you'll see that the stretch of sea between the bottom left tip of Scotland and the northeastern coast of Northern Ireland isn't actually that far. And if you've ever had the ferry crossing from near Stranraer to Belfast, then it doesn't take that long at all to get across. So Bruce had lands on either side of the Irish Sea there, And basically he is creating a secured area in southwestern Scotland, and he's waiting for reinforcements to come from his other lands in Ireland to build an army. He is going to land an army of his Irish supporters and use them to take the throne of Scotland away from the Guardians. Bruce calls in his allies. That includes one of the Guardians, James the Steward, who's in charge of lands, as we talked about, Renfrew through into Inverclyde and Ellen Butte. Two other Scottish earls come and join his side, and the Lord of Islay also answers his call. So he's got men coming from all across the west of Scotland. He targets common lands next to his down in southwest Scotland, and he does considerable damage. So he attacks their lands, destroys crops, destroys villages and townships, and guts a few of their castles. It was feared at the time that this conflict would spread beyond southwest Scotland and basically throw the whole of the Kingdom of Scotland into chaos. It did not come to pass. The Bruces failed to win widespread support for their coup. Now, a coup is a French word for when people try to use armed force to take control of a country illegally, and this is what Bruce is doing. Now you see on the map here, the red area coloured down in the bottom left hand corner of Scotland is Bruce's lands. That purple blob inside the red circle there that's called Andale represents those common lands that the Bruces attacked and had to go at first. Bruce's rebellion never really made it outside of that red shaded area. They didn't really push much further. The promised reinforcements from Ulster just across the Irish Sea failed to show up. No army came. It turned out there were situations kicking off in Northern Ireland at the time as well. It wasn't called Northern Ireland then, it was just Ireland. So the armies weren't able to come across the sea. They were already engaged in combat elsewhere. So it kind of knocked the steam out of Bruce's rebellion. So the remaining Guardians therefore gathered together an army to oppose Bruce, and faced by insurmountable odds, Bruce's rebellion dies out as he realises he doesn't really have a chance. So before it even really properly got going, Bruce's rebellion collapses and falls apart. All he takes in the end is 3 castles and smashes up some of the common lands. So outside of Bruce's shenanigans, we also had some other problems for the Guardians. One Guardian, Duncan, the Earl of Fife, the one whose hereditary position is to place the crown on the top of the next sovereign of Scotland, was accused of using his position to line his own pockets and was murdered by one of his relatives. It's a bit unfortunate. Up in northeast Scotland, fighting almost breaks out as well between the 2 common Guardians and their rival, their neighbour, the Earl of Atholl. Instability is also threatened by uprising against Scottish rule on the Isle of Man. At this time, after Alexander III beat the Vikings at the Battle of Largs, Scotland took control of the Isle of Man. So for the last 23 years, Scotland had held the place, although once the Guardians take control, Alexander III's out the way, the residents of the Isle of Man realise that Scotland's weak and they can toss off Scottish rule. So that's what happens, and the Guardians aren't in a place to really reassume control, so Man is lost. So the Guardians are kind of beset by problems on every front, really. Up in the northeast of Scotland, we've got fighting. One of them is getting assassinated in central Scotland. We've got the Bruce Rebellion in southwest Scotland, and we've lost one of the islands. So this all happens within the space of only a couple of years. So the Guardians have got a tough job on their hands. So as an overview of how they did, let's have a look at their successes and their failures. So one success of the Guardians is the selection by the nobility in the Church of Scotland shows that there's a level of political maturity and stability in Scotland. Yes, the Guardians are beset by problems, but the fact that the community of the realm can come together and place Guardians in control of the land, and do it for a long time as well, because remember the Maid is only 2 or 3 years old when the Guardians are put in position. That shows that Scotland is really quite a calm and stable place going into this process, so that shows some success. The Guardians successfully managed to avoid a civil war, so you can see the Bruce Rebellion was snuffed out, and up in northeastern Scotland the Commons resolved their difficulties with the Earl of Atholl, and in the Isle of Man they just allowed the rebellion to happen and they didn't send an army down to deal with it, so there is no widespread war and it remains broadly peaceful even though with threats on the horizon. So the Guardians also chose and secured through treaties a suitable husband for the Maid. Remember, bear in mind at this point she's like 3 years old, so it's a little bit weird and creepy, but it's very much the normal process for royal children at that time. So more on who that future husband is going to be in upcoming sessions, but they managed to organise a husband and there's one in the bag, so that's a success. That's going to help to establish stability for the future of the kingdom. And the Guardians showed loyalty to the throne of Scotland, so none of them themselves stood up to try and take the throne for their own benefit away from this infant girl. So it shows that the Guardians themselves are committed to their kingdom, they're committed to Scotland, and they're not giving in to their own personal greed. Now, balanced against that, we do have some failures for the Guardians. Some historians have argued that the community of the realm showed a certain amount of social equality for different parts of Scottish society, but that is not the case. It's really unlikely the Guardians had any connections at all with the lower classes. So this community of the realm that's been talked about as a kind of very progressive and very almost democratic way of deciding the future of the kingdom is still the rule of the few. It's the rule of the rich nobles and a few or a handful of powerful churchmen. The average person in Scotland is not getting a say on their future at this stage. And the final failure is the Guardians' power did wane a little bit during their control, as one of their number, the Earl of Fife, when he was assassinated, was not replaced. So we end up with 5 Guardians instead of 6 very swiftly. So that covers today's session on the Guardians and the next stage of our course. I'd like you to have a wee crack at answering these questions here once you've taken your notes down from today's video. These questions are asking you really to kind of think a bit more in depth about what's going on with the information you've gone through today. So to work out for yourselves the different aims and motivations of the people involved, because what we have here is basically the melting pot that's being created for the crisis to come. Things are going to go wrong very, very swiftly from this stage on. So let's see if you can pick apart the different signs of what is going to unfold from today's session. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.